Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today I'm continuing my coverage for the Tribeca Film Festival with the documentary Missing from Fire Trail Road. So briefly, the documentary unpacks the case of Mary Ellen Johnson Davis, a Native American woman who disappeared in 2020, exposing how hundreds of indigenous women continue to go missing in the US. Directed by Sabrina Van Tassel, the documentary is set in Tulalip, which is an Indian reservation near Seattle, and interviews Mary's sisters as well as cousins to give us insight into what may have happened to her. The documentary also interviews activists and lawyers and government officials to try to shed light as to why so many indigenous women continue to go missing and why these cases remain unsolved. The documentary does a great job of placing indigenous women and communities at this center. There's a huge discrepancy between what the government says happened and what these communities are saying is happening. Aesthetically, the documentary is stunning. We get all these shots of the reservation, which is just beautiful, all these lakes, these forests, it just looks absolutely pristine. And what should have been a safe haven is actually a cemetery and a hunting ground for predators. Women in the documentary describe how white men in particular seek refuge in this community because they know that the likelihood of punishment is low. And I think what I really appreciated about the documentary is that they really take us through the reservation and they really show us how this is not just a few incidences, this is a chronic problem. They really do show us how these men prey on these women, where they live, what they're doing, and what their intentions are. So I realized that a lot of these predators are just hiding in plain sight. One of the scenes that really struck me was these male encampments. A lot of criminals and degenerates basically choose to live in these communities to make a quick buck and to have a good time. The concentration of non-Indian men who live in these communities is not by accident. And these men are usually the worst, the worst of the worst. And they choose to live in these communities because they know they can get away with murder. One of the interviews that really struck me is with the executive producer, Deborah Parker. She explains how her aunt was viciously attacked by 4 men, and even though she survived, she never lived again. So much of the pain comes from this lack of closure, this lack of accountability. A lot of these lives feel very disposable, and it doesn't really feel like or seem like that the government is putting enough money or resources to try and not just solve these crimes, but at least deter them. And a huge part of the problem is that a lot of tribal governments have no jurisdiction over non-Indians. And ideally, you would think with the federal government in charge, they would have more resources and more bodies on the ground to prevent these crimes, to solve these crimes. Again, to simply deter these crimes, maybe have these men seek refuge elsewhere. But in fact, it's the opposite. When it comes to the federal government, this is really no surprise because historically they have been more interested in protecting the rights of non-Indians. The documentary does a good job of explaining why the federal government might not be the best institution to resolve this issue. In the case of Mary Ellen, her sisters describe how growing up, they witnessed a lot of children being taken away from their homes and placed with a lot of white families, their family included. And when they were placed in foster care, they suffered a lot of abuse at the hands of their foster parents. And even though the government compensated them with, I think, around $400,000, it didn't really stop these men from preying on them, from scamming them and taking everything they have. And I think a lot of the problem with these initiatives is that they're band-aids and they don't really deter criminals. In fact, they make them very easy targets to be taken advantage of. There's really no protections, and by protections I mean accountability. Because the number of unsolved cases and the number of indigenous women that go missing without a trace, without any real coverage from the press, makes it very difficult for anyone to be held accountable. And it really feels like these communities have been screaming for justice and their voices have just been muffled for years and years and years. One of the interviews that also struck me was with an FBI agent, and this guy shed absolutely no light on the issue. You could tell that he gave kind of recorded responses, and there have been really no attempt to properly document, keep data on the number of indigenous women murdered and missing. One of the points this FBI agent makes is how there's really no proof that indigenous women are targeted more often than other women, but it's a bit of a catch-22. It's like there's no proof because you refuse to actually put numbers to paper. And if you were to keep data and statistics, you would find that the statistics are alarming and they go back, generations. I think what else struck me about the documentary is how many activists, lawyers, members from the community, they all had similar stories of family members being victimized, being abused. And the problem is so common that it's almost been downplayed by the government. Like, I really appreciated the contrast between these communities, what these women had to say, what these family members had to say about their personal experiences, their personal stories, and then hearing what the government has to say or what the official narrative is. The discrepancy is huge. The documentary does its best to give us some historical context to really show audiences this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has been manifesting for some time. The documentary touches on the history of indigenous boarding schools in America, where the government will literally take children away from their parents and basically just kill the Indian in them, get rid of their culture, get rid of their language. And so many children from these schools went missing. And so many of these children who were missing or killed or abused, a lot of these crimes went totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, the purpose of these schools was to dehumanize them and take their land. They were trained not to be doctors or lawyers or really scientists, but they were trained to be maids and servants and really instill this inferiority complex in them. When you look at it from a historical context, it makes a lot of sense, because when you've dehumanized the people for so long, you've made them more susceptible to abuse. They seem less deserving of protection than other people and other groups. When you finish watching these documentaries, and again, they did a good job of leading with the community and kind of seeing where the story went, really following these women and hearing them out and trying to really get their perspective, you realize that this is not a senseless cycle of violence. This is one that definitely could be stopped, or at least decreased or deterred in some way. And the fact that these predators feel limitless in terms of the types of crimes they can commit, what they can get away with, the contrast between these predators and how limitless they are in terms of what they're able to get away with, and these communities that are so limited in terms of their ability to actually protect their communities, protect their people, is just so alarming. The documentary literally shows us how they're crawling with predators they have really no control over. They can't even really kick them out. They have no say, not just in terms of legally bringing them to justice, but even who's allowed in and out of these communities. That's also what's really alarming. So what's the solution? By the end of the documentary, it does note that cultural revitalization has increased. A lot of people are more and more interested in learning their language and finding their roots. And I think maybe this might be a generational issue where from one generation to the next, accountability is more possible. And this does require a more aggressive solution, because negotiating with the government has failed. And again, when you have no power to actually prosecute people or hold people accountable, let alone decide who lives in your backyard, it's no wonder this problem is getting worse. So I suspect that this is an issue that will take a long time to resolve, and it could be generational to generational, and does require, to be honest, a lot more aggressive approach. So you guys let me know what you think, and until next time.